A beginner's guide to MIDI. My subscribers will be more used to guitar lessons, so you're probably wondering what's going on. But MIDI is a really important subject that every musician needs to know at least a little about, no matter what instrument you use, or even if you're a singer. And the guitar course is slowly working towards how to write music using the guitar. And if you want to write your own tunes, MIDI, you'll find, is even more important to you. So let's get on with it. MIDI. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and the original MIDI was based around the hardware, which was a 5-pin DIN connection. And the DIN connection was used because it had been used with audio equipment for many years. And it actually started with 3 pins in the early 1950s for mono equipment. But as stereo equipment became far more common at the end of the 1950s and into the 1960s, the 3-pin DIN evolved into the 5-pin DIN, so it could be used with stereo equipment. Now, even though MIDI devices use the 5-pin DIN connector, there's no relation between the modern use of the 5-pin DIN and the old use of the 5-pin DIN. So, don't try to plug in an old piece of audio equipment into a MIDI interface, because you'll just burn the whole thing out. MIDI only really became popular in the mid-1980s when computers like the Atari ST made it affordable for people to actually run MIDI in their own homes. And in turn, this only happened because companies like Korg, Yamaha and Kawai started using MIDI interfaces on their keyboards. And with further development and discussions with those involved in the industry, MIDI was finally standardized in the early 90s. That's the hardware, the list of instructions sent down the wire, the patch list or voices, and the MIDI files. The traditional MIDI interface. I'm calling this the traditional interface because this is how it all started and how it works. And by understanding this, it makes it far easier to understand what's going on in your computer when you've got virtual interfaces. MIDI sockets are more commonly labelled in, out, through, and more recently, out, through. And each of these sockets has a particular task. The in socket receives instructions from other devices, and the out socket will send instructions to other devices. So, for example, if you've got a synthesizer module or a sound module, this is basically a keyboard without the keys, and the only way you can play those sounds is using an external keyboard. So you'd connect the MIDI from the out on the keyboard to the in on the module. And with this setup, whatever you play on the keyboard, you'll hear coming from the module using the module sounds. It's also important to note that the MIDI signal doesn't just carry what notes you're playing, it also carries things like modulation effect, pitch bend, and what sound you've chosen, and a lot more than this. If synthesizer or sound modules are new to you, here's an example of 4 different modules that have been mounted into a rack unit. And this is a desktop module. So, to be completely clear here, the MIDI signal doesn't carry any sound at all. It just carries instructions for the module or other audio device. Right, let's continue on with the connections. We've looked at the in socket, the out socket, so now let's look at the through socket. And to demonstrate this, we'll introduce a new second module to the example we're using. So we've got the initial keyboard where you play the notes and it goes out of the keyboard into the first module. But what if we want to connect two modules up? We then go to the through on the first module into the in on the second module. And this will allow the signal to go from the keyboard through the first module into the second module. And you could repeat this process for as many modules as you want. So with the second module, it would go through the second module into a third module. And this would mean everything you play on the keyboard will be played by all three modules. So in effect, you're creating a daisy chain of musical devices. The problem arises when you want to use just one of the modules and not play all three. And this is where channels come into it. Standard Midi has got 16 channels. So you can set up each device to only respond to signals on a particular channel. So in this example, I could set up module 1 on channel 1, module 2 on channel 2, and module 3 on channel 3. And of course, you can set 2 or more modules to the same channel if you want them to follow the same set of instructions. Some modules can be set up to receive 2 or more channels at the same time, so you can play several sounds in the same module at the same time using the channels. Now, if you want to share your MIDI file with different people on different systems, you'd have to make sure that your MIDI file follows the rules of general MIDI. And this means that, for example, channel 10 has to be used for all the percussion sounds. And with the other channels, each channel has the choice of 128 presets, which are the different sounds. So specific presets are reserved for specific sounds. For example, preset 1 will always be a piano, and preset 21 will always be a reed organ. Preset 41 will always be a violin, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into the details of general MIDI here, because I'm assuming you want to write music for yourself, which you can distribute as MP3s or some other form of WAV files, in which case general MIDI isn't important and you can disregard most of the rules. At some point in the future, I'll make a PDF with far more detail about the general MIDI setup, so you know what channels to use for what, and what patch numbers to use for what voices. If you'd like to get that PDF, and if you're not already, please subscribe and hit the bell icon, and then you'll be notified when I upload the video explaining how to get that PDF. Right, let's get back to explaining the in, out and through on the MIDI interface. Now, some devices only need to have an out, and this is because they're devices that are intended to control other devices. And some devices only have an in and through, or an in, out stroke through. And this is because these devices are designed to be controlled by another device, and not to control any other devices. So here's a couple of examples to simplify things. If you've got a keyboard that hasn't got its own inbuilt sound, this is meant to be a MIDI controller. So it's designed to be played and control a module. Therefore, it's only going to have a MIDI out on it, because there's no point having a MIDI in, because there's nothing to control in the keyboard. And if you have a module that's got lots of sounds on it, but no keyboard, it would have to have an in socket on it, so you could access the sounds. And more than likely, it'll have a through or an out through on it, so you can daisy chain it with other modules. However, it doesn't need to have an out. Devices that have out-throughs on them, quite often in their own settings, have the option of setting it as an out port or a through port. Or sometimes it's auto-selecting. The problem with things like MIDI interfaces is that even though there's a set of rules that are generally stuck to, there are multiple variations as to how they're used, and these are really the choices of the makers of the device. So quite often you'll have to refer to the user manual to be able to use the MIDI setup correctly. Don't be concerned by this though. Once you understand the basics of MIDI, it's really easy to learn how to use each different device. In this video, we've been talking about using MIDI with hardware or physical devices. However, you can use MIDI inside your own computer and never need to go near a physical piece of hardware. And this is done using virtual instruments. However, the same rules apply where you use the 16 channels and the 128 presets. But it's all done virtually within your computer. We'll cover this in another video because there's so much involved with it, it will take a video of its own. The advantages and disadvantages of using MIDI. I'll look at the advantages and disadvantages of using MIDI from a hardware point of view first, and then we'll take a look at the software point of view. From a hardware point of view, there's loads of advantages to using MIDI. From the simple fact you can access the sounds in a module, or several modules using one keyboard, to the fact that you can synchronize multiple drum machines or synthesizers so that they stay in time with one another. You can also add functionality to a device to make it more useful. So for example, if you've got a guitar multi-effects that's only got a few foot switches and you'd like to add more, you can using MIDI. Or if you've got a guitar multi-effects with no foot switches at all, say it's rack mounted, you can add foot switches to it using the MIDI. Most modern devices come with a USB port on them, or they'll come with a USB port and a MIDI socket, or in-out-through MIDI sockets. And this can be even more useful because you can use MIDI over USB. So you can connect your devices straight to your computer for recording and changing parameters. But having a USB port can offer you a lot more functions. For example, being able to update your firmware quickly and easily. And of course, USB is a lot quicker than the traditional MIDI. Looking at MIDI from a software point of view, MIDI has a lot of advantages when recording over standard waveform recording. In that, if you record something and you decide you want a different sound, you can change the sound without having to re-record it. Or if you make a mistake, you can actually change each individual note. And unlike when you play back a WAV file, which is a recording of what you've played, with MIDI, you're actually causing the computer to actually play the virtual instrument or the module, which means every time you play back the recording, it's playing the actual instrument perfectly without any loss at all. I'll just show you how easy it is to record and edit a MIDI recording using one of the built-in VSTIs or virtual instruments. When I've finished recording, it'll ask me if I'm happy with the recording, and for this example, I'll just say yes. I can now edit this recording and make it perfect. The third keystroke was a little weak, so I'm bringing that up a bit. And the notes weren't quite lined up in perfect time, so I'm resorting them. And I think I'll add another chord by copying this chord and just moving it down a little. And that middle note isn't the note I'd want it to be, so I'll just move it. I've also shortened the first chord so the change sounds more natural. Right, let's hear that. Now, because I'm actually playing the instrument rather than having recorded the sound, I could actually change the instrument or change the sound of the instrument quite easily. And I can do any number of changes I want to that sound or even change instrument, and I don't have to re-record anything. And that's it. I think that shows you just how useful MIDI can be. Right, I've listed a lot of advantages to using MIDI, but now I'll mention the disadvantage to saving things in MIDI files. And surprisingly, the biggest disadvantage is also an advantage. And this is the fact that you don't save the actual sound in the file, just basically the keystrokes of the keyboard. So therefore, if you take your MIDI file onto somebody else's system, you might find it impossible to get the sound you originally had. And if you're using something like a MIDI interface to play analog instruments, again, even on your own equipment, you might find it very hard to get the same sound back you had originally. So you do need to be aware of this. Once you've got your MIDI file perfect and you're tuned the way you want it, you want to then convert it or record it into a WAV file, so you've got that sound locked in. Now, this video's gone on a lot longer than I expected it to do, but this is a massive subject and certainly one we couldn't cover in one video. So I'll be doing more videos on this subject, especially as we get closer to the completion of the course that I'm writing on how to write music. Because once you start writing and recording music, you'll find MIDI really useful. But there'll be lots of different videos between now and then. And the keyboard I used to do the demonstrations in this video, I'll be doing an unboxing and review of that keyboard if you want to see that. I'll upload the video sometime this week. So if any of this interests you, please like, subscribe and hit the bell icon, and then you'll be notified when I upload these new videos. And if you're interested in completely free guitar lessons, visit my YouTube channel or go to www.ebooksforguitar.com, and there you'll find loads of free lessons, and you can download the free PDF ebooks that accompany the guitar courses. Thank you very much for watching, and to my subscribers, thank you very much for your support. It really is much appreciated.